Welcome to the Red Bull Theater Podcast, where guests discuss all things classical theater with your host, Nathan Winkelstein.
We are thrilled to have the wonderful multiple Emmy and Tony nominee and incredible classical actor, MICHAEL STUHLBARG. Hi, Michael. Thanks for joining.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
So, Michael, you've watched some of our conversations, and you know that previous to this, what we've normally done, because we're normally nice, is we ask our guests to speak about something that they know very well. So a monologue that they've already done from a role they've already performed or a role that they've really studied. And that allows them to look really great. And you, perhaps mistakenly, have offered to instead show us what happens when a great actor begins a process, as opposed to talks about it after a process. And so what you allowed me to do is to choose a role and a play that you have never done for you to look at basically cold and take us through your process starting from the very beginning. So I sent you a PDF this morning, which you may have seen what show it is, but you haven't really looked at. I gave you a nice, easy one, Angelo, in Measure for Measure. And specifically for anyone who wants to follow along at home, we're going to be looking at Act 2, Scene 4 in Measure for Measure. Michael, were you able to print out or prep the monologue and scene?
I got all the information. So, just going at it cold, and we'll see what comes of it.
And so just before we even start, what Shakespeare is ubiquitous. I assume you have heard of Angelo and Measure for Measure. What is your current experience with this piece?
I have seen Measure for Measure several times before, so I'm not completely coming at this cold. I've seen other people's, renditions of this portion of the play, and I, for some reason, it's never come along for me. I didn't work on it in drama school, although I've enjoyed the play a lot, and I do hope someday to do it. This isn't the role that I ever saw myself in. I saw myself perhaps as the Duke, but never as Angelo. So it is a blind side for me, which is cool.
Oh, well, that's exciting and already interesting, because when I thought of you as Angelo, I was like, the perfect Angelo. No. So we'll get to find out why I think that and why you don't. So, Michael, before we begin with the piece, you said that you have seen this show before. What do you as an actor do when you've seen a role that you're going to be performing? Are you the type who tries to completely forget that, not watch other roles, kind of leave them aside? Or are you a kleptomaniac / a studier of other roles? Will you seek out performances to explore?
Sometimes it's hard to forget certain things. And I would bring those memories with me if I were ever to get the chance to play these parts. So yes, I steal what works for me, because no matter how hard I would try or might try to emulate someone else, it's still going to be me up there doing it. So all of that just gets filtered into our minds. In fact, most of the successful, if I were to call it even that, attempts at playing Shakespeare's parts have come from watching other people do it and struggle with it and flourish with it. So yeah, I was one as a young person who found it difficult to understand the plays when I would read them on the page, but seeing them performed instantly gave me context and character and interpretation. And as I've said before, well, you can study it, Shakespeare as literature, but to me, it's always a play, and it comes to life in a way when it's performed, when it's spoken aloud. in a much more vivid way than it does when you necessarily read it on the page. At least for me, that has been my experience.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, given that I am going to be asking you to read this monologue out loud to begin. We may dig into the scene beyond that, but is that a artificial thing for this podcast, or is that something that you would do when approaching a role of Shakespeare's? Would you read it quietly, or would you read it out loud for yourself?
It goes a million different ways. Sometimes you can't hold yourself back from wanting to speak it out loud. Generally, my process has developed into a series of steps. Usually, the very first thing I would do if I was offered a part is I would write the whole thing out longhand. There is something to me about the process of seeing the words on the page, transferring them through your eyes, your brain, your mind to your hand, and putting them down onto the page physically. That is hard to replace in terms of getting to know what the role is or what the character is. That's a wonderful place to start for me, because then I get to know it intimately that way. And so if a line has fewer than 10 beats to it or more than 10 beats to it, I get to know that very quickly. It's an actual physical thing. The next, I guess, step would be doing just what I mentioned, noticing where Shakespeare has left a hole or given you extra beats to a line, if it is indeed a speech that's written in verse, or if it's written in prose, what the natural rhythm of that might be.
Well,
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense, and I think unfortunately I didn't give you enough time to write it out yourself. But I,
Oh,
I
no,
would
not
love.
at all. I think that's part of the fun of what we're, I think, trying to do today, is the idea of just approaching something fresh, not being familiar with it, and see what I might be able to find given what Shakespeare gives us with just the words on a first go through.
Well, great. Let's do it. Let's
Okay.
let's make you do this incredibly complicated
Now,
monologue cold.
you've sent me the scene afterwards. Are we continuing on and reading what's there together, or are we stopping with just this first thing?
So I think, because I sent the scene because obviously I think the context is going to be important for discovering the character.
Sure.
And I think that let's start with the monologue, somewhat in
Okay.
the same way one might do a scene study where we'll go chunk by chunk, and then if we get on to the scene, I will torture the audience with my Isabel.
All right.
Um, so we'll start with the monologue.
When I would pray and think, I think and pray to several subjects. Heaven hath my empty words, whilst my invention, hearing not my tongue, anchors on Isabel. God in my mouth, as if I did but only chew his name, and in my heart the strong and swelling evil of my conception. The state whereon I studied is like a good thing being often read, grown sere and tedious. Yea, my gravity, wherein, let no man hear me, I take pride. Could I with boot change for an idle plume, which the air beats for vain? O place, O form, how often dost thou with thy case, thy habit, wrench awe from fools, and tie the wiser souls to thy false seeming. Blood, thou art blood. Let's write good angel on the devil's horn. 'Tis not the devil's crest. How now, who's there? Well, that's complicated. My goodness.
I told you I chose an easy one.
My goodness. Yeah, this is interesting. And yeah, I would think, context gives you everything. But yeah, it's fascinating.
So for the context, I know that you having seen the show multiple times have it like obviously I would imagine that most of the time when somebody would begin doing this cold, they would have already seen the previous scenes and acts, and so we know that at the before this, Angelo and Isabella have already had one exchange, at the end of which Angelo starts to deal with the fact that he is very attracted to Isabella, and this is the next time we see him before Isabella is due to arrive again. Is there anything that you would want to add to that?
No, there isn't. Uh, he's by himself. He is either parsing through these thoughts he's having. I mean, I don't know. I guess feeling something for this person. If I remember correctly, it kind of surprises him that it's crept up. These feelings have crept up, and I'm not sure exactly what it is that are the you know that are the given circumstances. What leads him to say these words?
And
So I
so
don't have that information. So I'm looking at it simply apart from that. If you want
yes.
to inform me, please do.
Yes, of course. And the so right. So and then just for the audience, the what we're talking about here in terms of given circumstances is basically it would seem straightforward, but you'd be surprised at how many people don't do it, is in order to be honest and truthful about the lines you're saying, you have to know where the character is at. You have to know what has come before. And Angelo is Angelo is actually a little bit of a fall guy in Measure for Measure. The Duke has left the city. The Duke has left Angelo in charge of the city with an edict to uphold somewhat draconian religious laws
Right.
that have not previously been upheld, because he knows that Angelo will be so rigid with them that then the Duke can come back and appear merciful while still keeping some of that rigidity. It's actually a rather Machiavellian move by the Duke, which he spells out.
Right.
And Angelo's a true believer. He's a true religious believer. He believes in the law, and he believes in God's law, and he believes that it is the thing that he must follow. And when he runs into Isabella, who is a nun, a novice nun, who is there pleading for her brother Claudio's life, who has fallen victim to Angelo's draconian law, the two of them get on. Let's say the two of them think of the world similarly in how they think about God and man and law and truth. And Angelo, at the end of that previous scene, realizes he's very attracted to Isabella and
Right.
decides, perhaps wrongly, I think it's an interesting question, decides that this must be bad attraction. This must be lust. This must be sin. And he hopes to pray it away before meeting Isabella again. And this is the next time we see him after that discovery of attraction, which he has never had before in this way.
I was just noticing that the very first line is monosyllables. When I would pray and think, I think and pray. The line continues to several subjects. But to me, when I started learning about Shakespeare, some people would say just to notice these things. And if something is monosyllabic, perhaps it moves quickly, or perhaps it takes its time, and the words are. It's just to notice it, I guess, as to how it's phrased. But that was something that I just saw.
And What do you think of the first thing that I clocked about that line was the inversion of his thesis statement, right? When I would pray and think, I think and pray. Um, what do we think is going on? What's the point he would be trying to make with that line for you, just looking at it cold?
Another thing I've heard in terms of rules to be broken about Shakespeare is that the fourth beat of the line and the 10th beat of the line, those two words are meant to uh, anchor the line in some way, and that if you are puzzled, they are often the subject of the line, or they can help you find your way. In this instance, pray is both of those. When I would pray and think, I think and pray to several subjects. So that's interesting. It's not necessarily addressing your question, but when I would pray and think, I think and pray. Maybe he's he's as you mentioned, all the things that are going on inside of him, or that he's struggling with the lust that you mentioned, or that what is this that's going on inside of me? Perhaps he's just finding his way. When I would pray and think, I think and pray to several subjects. I don't know, but it is interesting, something to notice as well.
So you're paying attention to the fourth and 10th,
Yeah,
and they also both happen to be the verbs, which
right,
often people, that's another one of those rules made to be broken, is
right.
paying attention to verbs. And so you would begin, it sounds to me, Michael, like you begin very much with the verse tools of any speech you're looking at. Is that correct, that you
Yeah, I
start
look at the
there?
things that I've learned about that with each, whatever those rules are, and where does it deviate from there? And if it deviates, why does it deviate? Is he trying to tell us something? Because I learned Shakespeare was an actor as well as a playwright, and that he would often, in some cases, um, capitalize certain words. If you look at the folio, many of those words are capitalized as you're trying to find your way through this. And sometimes those can be helpful too, in terms of helping an audience understand what it is you're parsing through. And that's really a huge goal for me in general, is wanting to bring them along as clear as possible. And in the end, all of these rules are, you know, they're meant to help. If they don't help, you throw them away. And as my my friend Richard Easton used to say, that playing in general, Shakespeare in particular, was jazz, and that wherever it is, it makes sense to you, and where it takes you, to just let yourself keep playing and exploring, which is what I took him to mean. Um,
I love
so
that. I love
yeah,
the free form metaphor of jazz and the free form metaphor of free verse. That's great. So how would you then continue forward in this speech?
I would just keep starting from the top again to see where it guides me. When I would pray and think, I think and pray to several subjects. Heaven hath my empty words, whilst my invention, hearing not my tongue, anchors on Isabel. And that's interesting too, because you would think, okay, when I would pray, you pray to God. You don't pray to anything else. But he says, when I would pray and think, I think and pray to several subjects. So is that an insight into his idea of what God is? Or is this something that he's finding in the moment? That was another thing that one of my teachers used to say, is that verse, when it's written in verse, it's meant to be living thought. and it's something he's finding in the moment, as opposed to when something is written in prose. I was taught that that had subtext to it, but it may not be exactly what's going on in the moment. There's something going on underneath it. And in general, I bring that into rehearsals for this kind of stuff. And sometimes it's applicable, and sometimes it's not. Just like we've said, if it helps, keep it. If it doesn't, throw it out.
And
Please.
that fits what you're saying, Michael. That fits the school of thought of that especially in these later plays, that the characters, not exclusively, again, rules to be thrown out, but the characters discover and think on the end line. And if this sort of trying to word and understand what's happening inside him with just several subjects is right after an end line as a discovery moment. So that seems to fall under that potential tool as well.
Say that again. I don't quite follow you.
Absolutely. So there is obviously there are many schools of thoughts around the ends of lines in Shakespeare, but one of them is that the end of the line, rather than having to be acknowledged in some physical way like a pause or a breath,
Right.
is rather a clue that it is a moment when the next thing being said is coined. And
A discovery or a new thought, that kind of idea. Yeah, that was another thing that's, it's so interesting because this is just full of, rules, things that you learn when you study them. When I think of what you've just mentioned, whether it is an actual physical pause or just thinking of it as a new thought or a coinage, as you say, I am reminded of a rule of Peter Hall's, at least only that I've heard about, was that he thought every line, regardless of whether it had a final punctuation at the end, that there is a moment, a caesura, a pause at the end, which in some ways I've heard it said that it gives the audience a millisecond, a moment, to take in what it is you've just said. So in a sense, it's a tool to be understood and a tool to be heard. So again, the line is, when I would pray and think, I think and pray to several subjects. Another rule to be broken, because the line then continues on. I'll say it again. When I would pray and think, I think and pray to several subjects. Heaven hath my empty words. This is there's a break there. Again, when I would pray and think, I think and pray to several subjects, period. Heaven hath my empty words, whilst my invention, hearing not my tongue, anchors on Isabel. Both of those first two sentences end in the middle of the line, as opposed to the end of the line. The rule I mentioned was that one would continue your thought even though the end of the line is in the middle of the line. You would keep a pause at the end of Shakespeare's line and not at the period, which is in the middle of the line. I know this is complicated to listen to, but it's not that complicated when you look on the page. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
absolutely. So let me ask you a question then, Michael. Taking a little step back, and then we'll dive back in. Well, you are, as an actor, you are, I think, very, very respected for being so true, right? And that's one of the great demands of an actor, is to always be so true. And I can imagine some listeners going, these tools that we're discussing, how they sound like they're a way to turn you into a Shakespeare robot rather than a way to be true. Can you talk a little bit? I am not. That's a straw man. I don't agree with that argument. But can you talk about how these types of like if you explore a pause at the end of the line, or if you explore
Sure.
not pausing at a midline period, how that can help you be as truthful as you can be on stage, that sort of bridge.
Sure, I guess it's for me. It's a process of elimination. If these rules, like we mentioned earlier, rules are meant to be broken. If it doesn't work for you, or it doesn't convey the thought in a way you want to convey it, then throw it out. That's how I function. It is an interesting exercise, though, because sometimes you learn things about the line or about the character that you may agree or disagree with, but the words are put down on the page in a very particular way. So I guess all of these are meant to try to honor what is there, to find the need to say these things as they were put down. In the end, to throw that stuff away if it doesn't serve you. It's quite fun to watch actors after they've been through the rehearsal process and are in performance, you know, being quite loose with all of these things, adding ums and ahs and hymns, and making them as human as possible. Part of the fun for me in the doing of this too is not knowing exactly, after all the work on it, what it's going to be on the day, in the moment, when you're influenced by this particular audience on this day, or if there's a plane flying overhead, or if there's you have indigestion or whatever you had for breakfast, or if you've had an argument, or you're in a delightful mood. All of these things color how it's going to come out on a particular day. At least it's a goal on my part to be responsible to tell the story as we as a group decided to tell it, yet to let these little things inform how it might change today. Um, am I answering the question? I guess the improv of it all, the fun of it all, is in the moment. Uh, and all of this work that we do, all these little rules, are just meant to help clarify for ourselves and also for those listening what it is that's going on internally. Um, does that make sense?
Yes, very much. And it sounds like a version of the famous trope of you write the book and then you throw it away, of you need to do the work, you need to find the infrastructure of the piece in order to be free and true in the moment, that they're not far from being conflicting. The work is complementary to the ability to be free and responsive to the environment and the experience around you in the moment. Is that a correct
Yes,
summation of what you just said?
I would think so. I mean, it is in the end, to me, what happens between two people, and these words are our ladder to get towards what's underneath them, which is, in this instance, between Angelo and Isabella, quite heated and full. But the words guide you there, and they can help you. As far as I understand it, in studying Shakespeare's verse soliloquies, they are usually in three pieces. You have the introduction of what the idea is, what the discussion of what that where that idea leads you, and then your conclusion as to what it is you might do about this moment, a resolution of sorts. So that's another thing that I try to pay attention to as well. But yeah, I mean, the mysterious thing and why it never gets old and is the human aspect of all of this stuff. As wonderful as the ideas are, it is the marriage between an individual and these words that makes every production that you see different, because you have a new soul speaking these words aloud, and they might have different resonances for that person. it's also fun to attack these things at different times in your life. You might have one feeling about it when you're younger, and then, like, hearing a piece of music 10 years later or picking up an instrument 10 years later, you have changed. And so the words most likely will resonate with you differently as well.
Very cool. Thank you. You talked about the three pieces
Yeah.
of the soliloquy, and I actually think my guess is where we're sort of starting to maneuver into the speech. We're getting towards the end of the first of those three sections. Can we start at the top and see if we
Sure.
can figure out where those sections divide?
Absolutely. When I would pray and think, I think and pray to several subjects. Heaven hath my empty words, whilst my invention, hearing not my tongue, anchors on Isabel. God in my mouth, as if I did but only chew his name. I don't quite understand that. It's an interesting. The word God here in this edition has some kind of brackets around it. Does that mean it varies? The word varies from version to version.
That is correct. So sometimes it says God, and sometimes it says heaven.
Ah,
And I think it's what you talked about the sort of, for lack of a better term, the thesis statement section. It sounds to me on first blush like sort of if it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. Also works this
yes,
way, where he
yes.
seems to repeat himself in a different way. Heaven hath my empty words, whilst my invention, hearing not my tongue, anchors on Isabel. Heaven in my mouth, as if I did but only chew his name, and in my heart, the strong and swelling evil of my conception, which is synonymous with invention. It sounds to me like there may be two tries at the same idea.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for that. Uh, God in my mouth, as if I did but only chew his name, and in my heart the strong and swelling evil of my conception. Conception having a double
Of course.
entendre, which is great. The
And
state whereon I studied is like a good thing being often read, grown sere and tedious. So it seems like perhaps the first portion of this ends with conception and it starts to go there. So my guess would be that perhaps the reiteration of his exploration ends with conception and then moves somewhere else with the state whereon I studied. Now, I guess he's
I
talking about Isabella there. Is that correct?
So I think I agree with where the break is, and I think I also tried. I figured it would be unfair for me to have done a ton of research on it before too. So I'm also in discovery mode. But
Sure.
it does seem like, to sum up this first section, he's basically saying, well, when he prays to heaven, it's just in his mouth. It's not getting fully into his body, but his thinking on Isabel and his conception around what to do with Isabel, that's what's in his actual heart. And he knows it's evil, right? The swelling evil of my conception, which of course has a double entendre. Swelling evil is also I would venture, a double entendre.
Absolutely.
Now, as in what the state is, I'm not certain yet, though glancing at it, it looks like he's talking about his past. So possibly the state, the state of law, the state of God and order, the stuff that he used to focus on, but I'm not definitive as of now on that.
And
Um,
the word seer, that is also in brackets on here. Uh, it's a word that I remember being used in the Scottish play, but uh, do you know what it means? I usually have these Shakespeare lexicons to sort through. Uh,
yeah, And I think that this is an important point. So I'm going to point out I do know what it means, but I only know what it means because I looked it up. And I
Yep.
do think that there is this idea that people have that people who are professionals in Shakespeare, who are Shakespeare actors, don't need to look up words. And it's
Oh,
just not true.
well, there's another side to that as well, which is interesting because just because an actor might understand what a word is, it doesn't mean the audience is going to. And that is just something that comes with this territory. I mean, as a young person, there's a ton of words in here. Even as an old person, it doesn't matter how old you are, but there are going to be things that may not be in common usage anymore. And part of the fun for me is taking advantage of just barreling into whatever that word is to begin with. A word like seer has a very strong, using the word and choosing the word is a very valuable thing, which may convey just audibly to the audience a quality which may be enough. I guess that's what it is essential, what you're saying, but in conveying it to the audience, it's another kettle of fish.
I think that's great, and I think it's one of the most essential points of Shakespeare that's often lost is also how many of these words those characters were coining in the
Right.
moment. I think I've mentioned the Scottish play speech already, but like the use of the use of the word assassination is
Right.
coined in that, like literally coined by by Shakespeare. And again, you just chose seared, and it's right after a line break, right? Like the character
Right.
has to think about how to say it. Grown sear and tedious.
Here and tedious.
And it's
Yeah.
so
In fact,
onomatopoetic. It's great.
there are several of these. In fact, was that one, two, three, four, five, six? The first six sentences in this speech all end in the middle of the line, which is fascinating. And I'm sure there's something to that, which is interesting. It's just something to notice as well. Uh, I don't know exactly what it is, but when he comes to a kind of resolution at the end of the line down below, it is with blood, thou art blood. It's a kind of resolution to him, or a realization, perhaps, or a deep understanding of something.
I think that's great. And of course it makes sense that you would think that way because I know you played Hamlet to great acclaim, and Hamlet famously in his first couple of speeches, To Be or Not to Be is this way, is after his thesis statement at the top, To Be or Not to Be, that is the question, he doesn't get a period at the end of a line for a very long time in that speech.
Right?
It seems like the more the brain is rolling, the less a character seems to get to stop. Is that even at the end of a period, that next sentence is right there.
Right.
That next thought is intruding on the previous thought and it's flying forward. So I think that that's it's a really interesting instinct of noticing how few periods at the ends of the lines there are in this speech.
Well, that's sort of what I found in the doing of it as well, because um, it flies by, and it can fly by. And I guess the idea is to marry what we learn in the digging through the text and sharing it, but not to the detriment of what the evening necessarily needs to be. I guess also someone once compared the difference between how the British work or perform Shakespeare and how Americans perform Shakespeare. This is an anecdote that I was told, that an American will run, stop, turn, catch the ball, then start running again. Whereas the British will just start running and hope to God the ball falls into their hands. In other words, there is something to be said for keeping it moving, because as a piece, it has a kind of understanding to it that if you break it up too much, it can be harder to understand. And this is something that my teachers used to beat the hell out of me about. Not literally, just, metaphorically. Stop stopping so much. You don't need to feel it necessarily. But for me, it was always a process. I needed to understand in a very deep way what it is I was saying, so it would resonate with me when it came out of my mind, when it came out of my mouth. I had a need to say it. And marrying that understanding, that physical understanding, that need to speak, and then trusting that people will get it if you keep it moving. These are all things to balance and all things to find. And I guess all this exploration is meant to be is a way to mark your way through what it is you're finding your way through, or to cut it into pieces and to digest the pieces, and then to have a go and let those pieces take you where they will, on the on running with them.
Well, I think that and it's very interesting what you said, because I clocked when you were cold reading it how carefully you were going through, and it's something that I always feel is like, yes, Shakespeare moves, and I do think that this speech moves, but
Right.
you can't speak faster than you're thinking. And
Well, that's also that's true. Sorry to break. Go ahead, keep going.
I was just going to say that what I adored about how you cold read is you were really learning it. It was your first time reading it in the moment. And so you weren't going to rush it for the sake of rushing. That can always come later in a process. At the beginning, you can only go as quick as you can think it right now. And right now we're in the nascent moments.
At the very beginning, yeah. Well, it's so funny because once again, this goes back to my education, or at least how I met this stuff for the first time, is with a teacher who would close his eyes, put his hand over his eyes, and just listen so thoroughly. And he would tell us to stop and keep going back, and to slow down and to slow down. The initial phase was just slow down, take your time. Another exercise I had in school, which was fascinating, was a teacher of mine, DeLoss Brown, used to say, take each word and speak each word and project in your mind on the wall in front of you an image for that word. And so as these words eventually will be moving through us quite rapidly, these seeds that we plant about what it is the word invention brings up for us, or what the word pray might conjure for us physically, can actually deepen the process for you as well. Which is, it's time consuming and can be exhaustive, but and in this day and age when everything seems to be moving so fast, it's actually quite difficult to sit still and to let these words resonate. But you have to, because for it to come from a true place, a resonant place for you, all of these things can help us convey these thoughts. And some of it happens without our noticing it. That's the other kind of joy about theater in general, is that we're not watching ourselves do it. We are doing. That's it. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and I love the idea of I would the phrasing that came to my mind is making the words three-dimensional. They're not just the words, they are the images that they invoke, and that you need to see them in order to say them. I love that. And I think it's really...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I just think it's really interesting that what inspired this part of the conversation is the word seared.
Yeah.
which is a perfect example of a word like I think most people today, if they know seared, they know it as a cooking term.
Well, it's so
But
funny because on the page here it's written SERE, and in the Scottish play, the quotation, uh, the yellow leaf or something comes after the word when it's used in that play, and so in my mind, I'm taking with me both that common. How it sounds when it's said, which is to sear, like the cooking term you just mentioned. But then there's something that has, like a yellow leaf in the autumn is a dead leaf or something. It's as if something is without life to it. Uh, I'll look it up after we're done. Or
so it does mean withered.
okay, well that makes absolute sense then. But it is fascinating how uh, words can act on you, I guess.
Yeah, I'm of the camp that believes that many, many, many more words are onomatopoetic than we think.
Yes.
That sometimes, as you say, if you just explore what it is to say that word, it invokes what it is. Um,
And
and
behind all of this is the need to invent the word, or to say this word in particular. There is a need behind it. It's these are words that are chosen. I've also found, which is kind of fun, is that some of the more complicated speeches in Shakespeare are complicated on purpose, I think. They must be. And I think perhaps at the time that they were conceived, the time they were written, I'd like to believe that he understood, because he can also be absolutely clear as a bell when he wants to be. So these characters are choosing these words, and I guess that's always a goal as well, to understand where the choice is coming from.
yeah, I total agreement, Michael, which is boring podcasting. I should be disagreeing with you, but it's total agreement of like, I think often the reason characters repeat themselves in different ways, like Angelo does at the top of this, is they're trying to find the right words for it. They're
Right.
trying to explain something that what Shakespeare does very well is it does a wonderful job of explaining the unexplainable, internal conflicts that are very hard to put into words.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we forget that these human beings who are saying them might have trouble putting them into words and might need a couple of tries, and that's okay.
And you can
Um,
bring your audience along with that.
right.
Maybe that's okay. Um,
Um,
when I would pray and think, I think and pray to several subjects. Heaven hath my empty words, whilst my invention, hearing not my tongue, anchors on Isabel. God in my mouth, as if I did but only chew his name, and in my heart the strong and swelling evil of my conception. The state whereon I studied is like a good thing being often read, grown sere and tedious. Yea, my gravity, wherein no man, wherein let no man hear me, I take pride. Could I with boot change for an idle plume, which the air beats for vain? Well, this is complicated. I
yes.
thought I'd throw myself back into it again. Um, The state whereon I studied is like a good thing being often read, grown sere and tedious. And it helps in that instance, I'm finding, to just get through that thought as opposed to stopping necessarily. The state whereon I studied is like a good thing being often read, grown sere and tedious. Yea, my gravity, wherein let no man hear me, I take pride. Could I with boot change for an idle plume, which the air beats for vain? I don't quite understand what I'm saying. Uh,
S- I'm not sure either. If I had to, my guess and tell me how this resonates with you,
Uh-huh.
is that because he knows that he is so deeply obsessed with Isabella,
Yeah.
his gravity of demeanor, which he's always taken pride in, though he would never say it out loud,
Right.
he would throw away for like a lover's feather.
Right.
And especially if he's a Puritan, which is often how we read him, that kind
Yeah.
of fluff is very antithetical. So
I
basically, he's saying I'm turning into a non-religious.
So he's discovering something that's going on within him. Uh, uh, I'm sorry. Continue. Is that what I mean? I'm understanding it in a different way now, as you mentioned it. That he's the state he mentions is who he was before he met Isabel, perhaps, or
Yes, I think that's exactly right. The state is both who he was and what he believed in. So he believed in the law.
austerity, law, officious order, those kinds of things. It's like too much of a good thing. It can grow. It can grow withered and tedious. Yea, my seriousness, my gravity, wherein let nobody hear that what I'm about to say. Well, no.
That's
Yea,
right,
my
I think.
gravity, wherein let no man hear me. I take pride in my gravity. I take pride in my officiousness. I take pride in my puritanism. I could, with alacrity, change for an idle plume which the air beats for vain. So, is that the sense of it? That seems to make sense to me in speaking of it now, whereas before it didn't. So, that's good. Um,
Yeah, I think that
uh,
that's bang. I think that that's bang on. I think that that's exactly right.
and then he says, "Oh, place, oh, form." Another thing in Shakespeare, when he places these O's before a word, in some way, as far as the jazz aspect of this is concerned, it can be any kind of a sound or any kind of a release of what's going on in him at the moment, and it's a great it's a great sound making expression that can emphasize what comes right after it, or whether it's confusion or frustration or inarticulate feeling. It's a great place to put sound into embrace as opposed to just letting it go by. At least that's what I've learned about them. Uh, place, place meaning oh place, oh form, oh place, oh form. How often dost thou with thy case, thy habit, like Isabel who wears a habit, that double thing, thy case, thy habit, wrench awe from fools. O place, O form, how often dost thou with thy case, thy habit, wrench awe from fools, and tie the wiser souls to thy false seeming. That's another rule made to be broken or whatever, was that every time a word ends with a consonant that the next word begins with, I was taught that perhaps there is a discovery for that second word. It's a clue to find, like in this case, it's to thy false seeming, uh, which I find, as opposed to tying them together. It can depend upon the moment, but it's sometimes helpful.
Yeah, that's an interesting, especially on a consonant like S that sort of holds out of
Yeah.
that it almost like the discovery is on the extended S. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm this one's got me a little bit, Michael. What I think we're talking here a little bit about the body
Right.
and how the body betrays the the mind, but I'm not certain. Which is good. We don't have to be certain when we're first exploring a text. But it's a
It
tricky
does.
wicket that he's exploring here.
Indeed. It does make some sense, though. If he says, oh, uh, well, let's go back and jump into it. But the state whereon I studied is like a good thing being often read, grown sere and tedious. Yea, my gravity, wherein let no man hear me, I take pride. Could I with boot change for an idle plume which the air beats for vain? Oh, place. Oh, form. How often dost thou with thy case, thy habit, wrench awe from fools, and tie the wiser souls to thy false seeming? So, oh, place, meaning, oh, oh, form, oh, this body of mine, or oh, this place I'm in, this state I'm in, oh, this state I'm in, oh, this body of mine. How often dost thou, with thy case, the way, thy case, thy habit, wrench all from fools, and tie the wiser souls to thy false seeming. And the body turns us into.
Well, some of this language seems to be about
There's also the juxtaposition of fools and wise. Those. Sorry, keep going. What were you saying?
yes, no, it's I think that he's making a point. It seems like not just the body but also the looks, right? It's form, habit,
Right,
case,
right. Case,
seeming.
how thou present, how something is presented. She in her habit, her nun's habit. He in his role as the temporary duke, wrestling with the idea that it seems as if it might be about how the outsides, one's appearance, can guide people to behave any particular way, whether it's if you are the austere duke who brings gravity to his pronouncements, or if it's Isabel's habit, how one feels when one is presented with someone in a full nun's habit, and how that might change how you feel about someone because of their exterior is, I guess, what I'm seems to be suggesting. In some ways, it can make fools be in awe, and it can even bring the wise to your whim. It can make appearances can cause you to be led astray. Something to that.
So, Michael, that does make sense to me. And of course, we're still in the not knowing, and we would continue to discover, circle, 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 and discover as we went on. I do wonder if he's talking right now about seeming and the case and the looks of people, when he moves immediately from that, even though there's a caesura there, he moves in the same line to this phrasing, blood, thou art blood. I wonder those thoughts must be connected, and would you begin to explore how they might be connected?
One could just speak it aloud and learn from the doing of it. It seems to be leading from seeming to truth to me. in my first exploration of it, we're talking about how appearances can provide, um, appearances can lead you astray. However, blood is blood is blood. How one feels is how one feels. Um, so in one sense, it's not necessarily at least in my first inception of this, it he's talking about how one can be led astray by seeming, yet blood, thou art blood.
That makes sense to me, and it sounds like it looks like from the neck. Well, it seems like he has this. The reason I think it's an important line is it feels like it's the decision point. Given the next two lines he says, does it maybe make sense to pick up from "O place, O form" and just hear it through the end and see if that, as you say, if just saying it and hearing it helps clarify?
You know what else is? I just realized there's a beat missing from that final part of the line. The line, as written, is "To thy false seeming blood, thou art blood," and then there's an empty beat at the end.
So, Michael, do you believe that a missing syllable in a line is always saying that there's space at the end of the line, or can it fall anywhere in the line? Is it telling us that we have room to pause anywhere in the line, or mainly at the end?
I think it's actor's choice. I think it could work either way. Since the line is broken in two and there is a beat missing, in a sense, it could be a clue that it's a revelation. The state whereon I studied is like a good thing being often read, grown sere and tedious, yea, my gravity, wherein let no man hear me, I take pride. Could I with boot change for an idle plume which the air beats for vain? Oh, place! Oh, form! How often dost thou with thy case, thy habit, wrench awe from fools, and tie the wiser souls to thy false seeming? Blood, thou art blood. Let's write good angel on the devil's horn. 'Tis not the devil's crest. How now? Who's there?
And that was wonderful. It's amazing how much it's even evolved just in the course of this hour. What is his final decision here? The blood, thou art blood, let's write good angel on the devil's horn, 'tis not the devil's crest. Where does he come to at the end of this speech?
It's a good question. Let's write good angel on the devil's horn. 'Tis not the devil's crest. I don't know. That's usually where I start out. I don't know.
Yeah, well,
Blood, thou art blood. Maybe it's despite all of this, my blood is what it is. Blood feels what it feels. We feel what we feel. So let's write good angel on the devil's horn. 'Tis not the devil's crest. I don't know. Do you have a thought?
I actually think that you just, I didn't, and then you said that, and now I do, which is nice. It's nice how that works, which is this idea of he has fallen. He accepts in blood, thou art blood. He accepts that his human blood has fallen. It wants what it wants. And if he falls as one of the purest of humans, one might as well write good angel on the devil's horn. 'Tis not the devil's crest. Is basically, if he can fall from from heaven to hell, then you might as well say that hell is heaven, because everything's been inverted in this obsession of his. Is where I find myself going to. Does that register at all with you?
Yes, it is a kind of resolution in some ways. Blood, thou art blood, and the afterthought is part 3 of this. It is a kind of resolution, yeah. So let's write good angel on the devil's horn. But I don't understand necessarily the difference between the devil's horn not being the devil's crest. I'm sure there are helpful notes to understand it.
It's already fascinating how much one can learn even in just an hour. Thank you, Michael, for being willing to kind of work through and being willing to not know and explore. What did you have any final things that you felt like you discovered even in saying at that time?
Sure. I mean, the more you do it, like anything, the more you know it, and the stronger the images you can conjure. And in some cases, a difficult line like, let's write good angel on the devil's horn, 'tis not the devil's crest, until you understand it. It may just remain a little puzzling until one day it makes a greater sense, or the need to say it is clearer for you. I always start at a place of ignorance. We all do. And so in some ways, it is always a revelation that if you apply yourself to a piece of text, you can find your way. It can be frustrating, and you can feel, stupid along the way. I usually do. But the more you do it and the more you speak it aloud, the more it comes to life and the more your understanding happens.
Well, that's lovely, Michael. And I think that is absolutely, it's a wonderful place to end it. I do agree that I think creatives have to live in a place of being uncertain for a really long time until we actually know what's going on. And I think sometimes we get scared when we don't know, but knowing that it's good not to know, and it's good to remain curious as far as we go. So thank you for that. And thank you. I've used up too much of your time. So much gratitude, Michael, for coming on.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. And it's a pleasure. Thanks.
We hope you've enjoyed this Red Bull Theater podcast. To see what else our theater is up to, please go to redbulltheater.com, where you will be met with a cornucopia of podcasts, readings, classes, seminars, and of course, productions. All of this programming is only possible through the support of people like you. Please make a tax-deductible donation today at redbulltheater.com to support Red Bull Theater and invest in the vitality of classical theater for a contemporary audience. I'm your host, Nathan Winkelstein. Thanks, and ever thanks.